Be in Daniel chapter 8 tonight. Daniel chapter 8 might be a little bit shorter because while verse-wise the quantity may not be that short, but it gets to the main point or the main emphasis rather quick. Whereas the other vision that Daniel had in Daniel chapter 7 got into 4 kingdoms, and we got into the reality that while most of the kingdoms relate to past experiences and past rulers, past kingdoms, it also has a future aspect of resembling the kingdom of the Antichrist, which will come later. And it has this futuristic aspect also to this prophecy that not all of it had been fulfilled. It was a part of the already and the not yet, that within Daniel's time, some of it was being fulfilled, and then after Daniel's time, it was being even more fulfilled. But then there's still something throughout Daniel's death, lots of years later, even in our own time, that we're still waiting for the fruition of the fulfillment of this prophecy. But Daniel chapter 8, he gets into one vision about 2 animals. We'll look at verse 1 through Daniel chapter 8 and read on to verse 14. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first." And if you notice, the language is a little bit different than some of the rest because most of Daniel is written in a different language than now it's written in Hebrew. So it's kind of, the translation is a little bit different than the rest. "And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and as I was at Ulia canal, I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up at last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue from the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host, and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Easy enough, right? Okay, we can go on from there. Yeah, simple enough. That's a simple prophecy to go from. Well, Daniel's previous vision back in chapter 7 was a revelation of 4 beasts that we mentioned earlier. They represented 4 different kings or 4 different kingdoms. All kingdoms of the past for us, save the kingdom of the Antichrist. But the thing that all these kingdoms have in common, the thing that all these previous kingdoms in chapter 7 have in common, is that they will all be surpassed by the kingdom of Christ. That's the main thing that they all have in common. While one takes over another, eventually they will all be overtaken by the kingdom of the Son of Man. That's the kingdom that will outlive and overlast all other kingdoms. This kingdom is the everlasting kingdom, and it is the only everlasting kingdom. And one of the best news for us is that he gives us the possession of this kingdom. Later on in chapter 7 we saw what a responsibility, what a weighty responsibility that is. Now, a couple years passed between that vision and this vision. So And it's not quite like Daniel's just laying in bed and he's just getting all these visions time and time again. After he received that one, a couple years more have passed after that, and then he receives another vision. This is a lot to take in. If you recall in the previous chapter, Daniel was very troubled from it. The language describes him almost as the color leaving his face. Especially that fourth beast disturbed him so much that he didn't know, he almost seemed to have a crisis within himself. He didn't know how to handle himself. Which, it kind of puzzled that, because you know that we saw who was the victor in that. And Daniel has faced a lot in his life, but still that fourth beast, that fourth kingdom really troubled him so much it seemed as though he had trouble sleeping throughout the rest of the time until he could regain himself. This vision also troubles him. Now the timeline of this vision is such that the fall of the kingdom of Babylon is close at hand. It hasn't fallen yet. Belshazzar is still king. He is still ruler. But that won't last for much longer. Cyrus is coming, and he's about to take over this kingdom. Cyrus and Darius is about to take over this kingdom and kill Belshazzar. Now, this vision won't make much sense to him right now, but as this one kingdom takes over that kingdom, it's going to start to make more sense to him. So in this vision, Daniel sees a ram, which represents, and we read later on that he has actually given the interpretation of this vision. This ram represents the Medo-Persian kingdom, which takes over later, both in Darius and in Cyrus. But he says that both horns, while they're high, while they're tall, one's a little bit higher than the other, which denotes once again, like with the bear and the uneven side, it shows that the Medo-Persian kingdom is a little bit uneven, because the Persians are stronger, the Persians are greater in both quantity and quality than their kingdom that they're trying to combine with the Medes. And it's not uncommon for a ram to be represented by Persia, because Persia, that's kind of their sign is the ram, and that's part of their emblem, and that's a common referral of the ruler is that he's strong as a ram. The ram says it's charged westward, northward, and southward, which the Medo-Persian Empire took no great victories in the east. But it shows that they have a lot of feats. So this kingdom expands very far, and even says that it's very mighty, that this ram is going around just taking army after army. He mentions three things. He says, no beast could stand before him. There was no one who could rescue from his power. And he did as he pleased and become great. He became very mighty. Cyrus was uncontested. He was unparalleled at that time. And they even came to destroy Babylon, which Babylon was known as the golden head. Babylon was known as the top of the kingdoms. And yet the ram came in, tore it down, but there's going to be someone that's going to take down the ram. The ram is uncontested until something stronger comes on the scene. The ram is challenged by a goat. So the goat comes on in Daniel's vision, which represents Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. So the Greek Empire comes by and utterly wipes out and destroys the Medes and the Persians. The goat was a representation of the powerful Greek Empire and its expanse. It said that it would have been west for the Babylonians and also for the Persians. It says that this animal was raised up from the west, came, wiped them out, had no trouble doing that. Did you notice this duel is not much of a duel? It just comes by, it smacks it right against its head, and the ram's horns just break. Just bust up. There's not much. It's not a big fight. There's not much always giving and taking. What are going to happen here? It's just pure muscle, force, and power comes in and wipes someone out. That's much less powerful. The animal's description of great agility and power well describes Alexander the Great's rule. Alexander the Great was just that. I mean, if you have a name you have to be pretty great to get that. That's pretty simplistic. But Alexander the Great took a lot of land, and he took it very quickly. The Greek Empire makes war with the Medo-Persian kingdom and wins with very little struggle. Verse 8 says that the great horn is broken. So this animal has this great horn which destroys this kingdom, or destroys the ram, which is Alexander the Great. But the horn is broken, so Alexander dies, and 4 horns come up in its place, which shows that the 4 generals of Alexander have to split up his kingdom. But He has so much land. Think about that for a minute. That he has so much that he is control over that they have to split it up before 4 people. And they're 4 very smart, wise people. I mean, a little crazy, but for the most part, these are 4 very wise people. And yet Alexander was running all of that. I mean, he had his 4 generals, of course, but there's so much that he owned that they decided, we'll split it up between 4 people. It's a little bit hard to kind of contain all of this ourselves. And the little horn and the evils that's attached to it is one of his successors. And most scholars, and I say by most, it's probably like 99.9%, agree that this is none other than Antioch Epiphanes, the successor to Alexander the Great. Scholars refer to Antiochus as being the Old Testament Antichrist. That's a bad dude. If you're referred to as an Old Testament Antichrist, you have to be pretty evil. And he was evil, the ruler of this Greek portion of Alexander's kingdom. After Alexander's death, this evil ruler's reign expands far and wide, even reaching to the glorious land. So Antiochus takes control over all Israel, and he hates Jews. He hates the law of God, and he hates the people of God. If you're familiar with Hanukkah and the history of Hanukkah and the history of the Maccabees, the Apocrypha, what as Protestants we don't recognize as canonized scripture, but in Catholicism there's the Apocrypha, and the Maccabees are in the Apocrypha. And the Maccabees records how wicked Epiphanes was. So much so that his name even denotes revelation, or think of the term epiphany. You're sitting there and something is revealed to you, and it's like, oh, I had an epiphany. Something really came to me. Something was illustrious. Something was revealed to me. His name was that. It basically denoted that he was being revealed deity. Their coins that he had circulated said Theos Epiphanes, which meant the revealed God. He thought of himself so well that he thought that he was the perfect manifestation, the perfect revelation of what God was truly like. Imagine having a ruler like that. Can you think for a second if you had a president that came up and made a new form of currency, said we're getting rid of all these bills, and put on the coins and said that he was the true revelation of God? That'd be hard to swallow, wouldn't it? This man was so vile that he referred to himself as the greatest revelation that heaven has ever seen upon the earth. Antiochus exalted his own name and his own glory and had no regard for that which is holy. So Antiochus would go around, find out who was true adherents to the law, try and trick them, get them to attend a meeting, and then slaughter them. So he wanted the Jews to see who was truly the adherents, truly Orthodox Jews. He would get them to attend meetings, and then he would flip it around, and then he would murder them. Not only that, but he didn't like their temple. He didn't like their sacrifices. So what he did is he found, he's studying the law. He knew that certain animals were unclean. And so he took pigs in the sanctuary and slaughtered them upon the altars. Pig's blood is scattered all throughout the altars. Pig guts and pig feces throughout the entire temple. Now, as a Jew who considers pigs to be unclean, and even if you touch it, you have a double conundrum there, because you have the dead carcass, and then you also have pig's blood. You also have the defilement of the pig itself, considered as a Jew, and you can't clean it yourself. Your only hope as a Jew is that someone would go in and clean it for you, because you can't touch it. So for a long time, their temple was considered desolate, their temple was considered desecrated, because it was covered by an unholy animal. It was considered that Antiochus exterminated somewhat of 100,000 Jews. He would find their scriptures in their synagogues and their temples, and he would rip them apart. He commanded his soldiers, it says in Maccabees, that he commanded his soldiers to go in to rip their scriptures in front of their faces and to burn them. So this description of saying that he throws truth to the ground, he will act and prosper, says that he will be great, he will be powerful, and his name will be considered contested with the name of the Prince of the Host. His soldiers were commanded to do vile acts, this man lived, spoke, and breathed blasphemy. Pretty much, if he could figure out a way to blaspheme Yahweh, Jehovah, he would do it. Now, the author, in fact, it was so obvious for historians to realize that this is who this was talking about, that they thought that Daniel was written after the fact, because Antiochus was considered such an evil person. And this because he desecrated, says that he stopped the regular burnt offering and he discontinued the sacrifices, and that he trampled underfoot the holy temple. Now, as Daniel hears two people talking, he mentions how long is this going to last, and he gives this time period of 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, is that 2,300 days? Or some scholars say, is that considered 2,300 sacrifices? Which there's 2 sacrifices during the day, given according to Exodus, so maybe that's half. Maybe that's 1,150. Maybe that's 1,150 days. But either way, if you consider that, 2,300 evenings and mornings, if you consider it 2,300 days, it'd be over 6 years, it'd be 6.33 years. The temple was cleansed and rediscovered by Judas Maccabeus, if you count back from 170 BC. So if you count back from when the temple was rededicated to the start of his reign, that would be about accurate. But if you considered the half of the days, it would still be considered pretty accurate, considered of a certain portion of not just of his rule and reign, but specifically when he desecrated the temple up to its cleansing. So whether you count it up to 6 years or 3 years, it still evens out to be Antiochus. Now, this vision that Daniel has is probably given somewhere over 350 years before this ruler comes on the scene, which shows me that the word of the Lord never fails. I mean, this is 350 years before this comes about, and yet this very, very specific prophecy is given about this very evil person, and given to encourage his people. Because if you know of some people like what's the one, Nostradamus and people like that give prophecies of what it's going to be like, but it's very vague and very broad and very general. Or within this year span, something bad's going to happen. Okay, well, you can get about every year something bad's going to happen. Well, right now we can get into the coronavirus or whatever. And it's wow, he was right. Well, yeah, of course, if you give very broad, very general prophecies, yeah, of course it's going to be right. But this is extremely specific, even down to the amount of days. 2,300 evenings and mornings. And even if you cut it down into half, it's still very specific down to a certain time period. Then this vision is interpreted. We've kind of got into most of this already, but in verse 15, it says, "When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Uli, and it called Gabriel. Make this man understand the vision." This is Gabriel's first mention in the book of Daniel. And he's saying to give this vision, someone's speaking to Gabriel to give the interpretation of this vision. "So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end.'" Now, if this portion of this scripture just ended right there, it seems like everything is going to be fulfilled within that 200-300 years after Daniel. But there's certain portions here that seem to point, because it seems like, okay, we got this under our belt, we know what this is talking about, it seems like this is all going to come to pass, and it means not much for us today. But then he goes into talking about, well, this is going to be a time for the end. And then he says, "When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. He said, 'Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation.'" Almost sounds like some of the texts that we know of that talks about the Antichrist and the time of the indignation, the time of wrath, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. "As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. I like that added. And in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. And he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision. It did not understand it. You ever have something so affect you so much, and yet, unfortunately, you can't call a timeout. Unfortunately, you have to go to work. Unfortunately, you have to make dinner. Unfortunately, you have to continue on with your life. This troubled Daniel so much again, where he says that he just lies for sick for days, but then he has to go about back into the king's business. But I'm sure that this vision greatly troubled Daniel, because especially for Daniel, he had no clue what was about to come. I mean, he had some idea about what the kingdom was about to come, destruction. But I, with several other people, think that this vision has both much like with the previous chapter, seems to have a double prophecy aspect to it as well. Luther mentioned how this vision of the last beast also seems to represent things that also talk about the spirit of the Antichrist. They also talk about the power of the Antichrist. Notice how many times is going on that it mentions the things that's going to be given to him and how much power he's going to have, but yet it's not his own. It's this power, this strength that's given to him, this power that's given to him, and yet it's taken away eventually, and it's not his own. He's empowered by the evil, much like the Antichrist will be empowered by the forces of darkness, allowed to do so much. And maybe that was one thing that was so troubling to Daniel, is how could this man be given this much power? How could God allow this man to reign this way and to destroy so many of God's people? That may have been the main thing that was troubling Daniel. But God limits his power. Satan, the Antichrist in the future, he can only do what God allows him to do. Think of the scene where the devil goes before the presence of God, and he has to ask for Job's flesh, right? He has to ask before he can touch Job. He just can't do it. God had a hedge of protection around Job. So he's not allowed to just go in and do whatever he wants, does whatever he pleases. But he has to ask for permission first. And if you recall, when Jesus told Peter, he said that Satan has asked for you. You can't just do whatever he wants. Satan has asked for you to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. I think there's a few hints of biblical application of which we have. Rather quickly, biblical prophecy should leave us in awe. Fulfilled prophecies display the all-encompassing wisdom of God and should inspire worship. It's not just for us to read this and say, hey, see, the Bible's true, and so now we can go to our atheist friends and prove that this was written so many years back. They're able to find these ancient scrolls and these ancient parchments of these scriptures, and they were written so long, and these were fulfilled, and say, see, look, it's true. While it does show the validity of the scriptures, it's not just there so we can put it in people's faces and see, this is true. It's there to also inspire worship out of us, that we serve an amazing God, a God who is able to predict things, that lives beyond time and space, in which we are so accustomed to live into and to be entrapped in, really. I mean, isn't our lives governed by time? I mean, we had today, and we scheduled in time, and we have a scheduled ending, and we have what we're going to do tonight at bed, and then we have a time that we get up, and our lives are so reoriented around that. But yet God is not limited to that. He's beyond that. Biblical prophecy should inspire worship. And also, prophecy yet to be fulfilled leads us to dependence, patience, and holiness. 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about the new heavens and the new earth. It says that the first earth is going to be burned up, going to be dissolved. He says this in verse 11. He says, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in the lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set in fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. That sounds kind of troubling, like fire sounds, but fire is purifying. Heaven isn't even to the place at which God ultimately wants it. Heaven is great, heaven is blessed, but still God has a desire for the fulfillment of heaven to be here. A new heavens and a new earth. Perfection reigns, righteousness dwells. But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. 3, Daniel chapter 8 shows us that God gives and takes away power. Mentions about this ram, not by his own power, he reached his limit, and not by human hand. It said that he was destroyed, but it wasn't by a human hand in which he was destroyed. All forces of evil have a limit to how far they can go. And once they reach that limit, they're done for. A Puritan by the name of Stephen Charnock used to say that it's amazing how in the scriptures, when evil thinks that it's accomplishing its own purposes and God turns it around for something good. It says it's as if an archer pulls back on his bow, tries to shoot at its own target, and yet really in all actuality it hits God's target. That you've meant it for evil, you meant it for destruction, but God meant it for my good. God allows the forces of darkness to take power, but it is very limited according to his word. It only goes so far and no further. The Antichrist will rise with power, then that power will be wiped out by God. It's not even really a fight. It wasn't a fight for the kingdoms that we saw in the previous vision and the forces of evil. It's not going to be a fight of evil just really going to war with God. God speaks and evil is extinguished. And last, God will remain the victor over all forces of evil, all forces that come against him and his people. Against all the evils that we may face in this world, God will always be our rock. God will always be our victor. Last verse, and I love this verse, Romans 16:20. It says, the God of peace, notice that, it says, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. Those are two terms that doesn't seem like they should go together. The God of all peace is going to crush Satan under your feet. The imagery there is you yourself are on the neck of Satan, and Jesus allows you to crush the head of Satan. The God of peace. But that's the most peaceful thing, is the extinguishing of evil. God destroying the evil that we come in contact